that was very nice. I have a lot to live up to. It's an honor to be introduced by Sigrid, whose work I've been reading for years. With great pleasure. She's at work on another novel. And it's great to be here. Tonight I'm going to read from the new book, Can't and Won't. And I've, just for the sake of my own peace of mind, I've divided the reading into sort of sections of different kinds of stories. There are a lot of stories in the book. I lost count because I think I kept changing my mind, but it's around 120. So there are different kinds of stories in there, and I'm going to start by reading what I would call the everyday stories, or the stories about daily life. The first one, which is the first in the book, is called A Story of Stolen Salamis. My son's Italian landlord in Brooklyn kept a shed out back in which he cured and smoked salamis. One night, in the midst of a wave of petty vandalism and theft, the shed was broken into and the salamis were taken. My son talked to his landlord about it the next day, commiserating over the vanished sausages. The landlord was resigned and philosophical, but corrected him. They were not sausages, they were salamis. Then the incident was written up in one of the city's more prominent magazines as an amusing and colorful urban incident. In the article, the reporter called the stolen goods sausages. My son showed the article to his landlord, who hadn't known about it. The landlord was interested and pleased that the magazine had seen fit to report the incident, but he added, they weren't sausages, they were salamis. Circular story. On Wednesday mornings early, there's always a racket out there on the road. It wakes me up and I always wonder what it is. It is always the trash collection truck picking up the trash. The truck comes every Wednesday morning early. It always wakes me up. I always wonder what it is. Circular story, meaning it could just keep going. She will never know what it is. My Sister and the Queen of England. For 50 years now, nag, 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 and harp, harp, harp. No matter what my sister did, it wasn't good enough for my mother or for my father either. She moved to England to get away and married an Englishman. And when he died, she married another Englishman. But that wasn't enough. Then she was awarded the Order of the British Empire. My parents flew over to England and watched from across the ballroom floor as my sister walked out there alone and stood and talked to the Queen of England. They were impressed. My mother told me in a letter that no one else receiving honors that day talked to the Queen as long as my sister did. I wasn't surprised because my sister has always been a great talker, no matter what the occasion. But when I asked my mother later what my sister was wearing, she didn't remember very well. White gloves and some kind of a tent, she said. 4 Lords of Parliament had mentioned my sister in their maiden speeches because she had done so much for the disabled, and she treated the disabled, my mother said, like anyone else. She talked to her drivers the same way she talked to the Lords, and she talked to the Lords the same way she talked to the disabled. Everyone loved her, and no one minded that her house was a little untidy. My mother said the house was still untidy, and my sister was still letting her figure go. She invited too many people into her home, and she left the butter out all day. She told too much of her private business to her friend, the Indian grocer on the corner, and she wouldn't stop talking. But my mother and father felt they had to keep quiet because how could they say anything against her now? She had done so much good and was so much admired. I'm proud of my sister and I'm happy for her because of the award. But I'm also happy that my mother and father have finally been silenced for a while and will let her alone for a while, though I don't think it will be for long. And I'm sorry it took the Queen of England to do it. A note from the paper boy. She tries to get her husband to look at the dog and the cat lying stretched out together companionably side by side on the floor. He is immediately annoyed with her because he is trying to concentrate on what he is doing. Since he won't talk to her, she then starts talking to the cat and the dog. Again, he tells her to be quiet. He can't concentrate. What he is doing is writing a note to the paper boy. He is writing a note in answer to a note they have received from the paper boy. The paper boy has written that when walking through their yard in the dark in the early morning, he has, quote, met several animals, like skunks. He is announcing that from now on he would prefer to leave the paper outside the yard at the back gate entrance. Now, in response, her husband is writing to the paper boy, saying, no, they prefer to have the newspaper delivered, as always, to the back porch, and if he can't do that, they will discontinue the paper. In fact, according to the grammatical construction used by the paper boy in his note, it is the animals themselves who are not only walking through the yard, but also delivering the paper. Negative emotions. A well-meaning teacher, inspired by a text he had been reading, once sent all the other teachers in his school a message about negative emotions. The message consisted entirely of advice quoted from a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. Emotion, said the monk, is like a storm. It stays for a while and then it goes. Upon perceiving the emotion like a coming storm, one should put oneself in a stable position. One should sit or lie down. One should focus on one's abdomen. One should focus specifically on the area just below one's navel and practice mindful breathing. If one can identify the emotion as an emotion, it may then be easier to handle. The other teachers were puzzled. They did not understand why their colleague had sent them a message about negative emotions. They resented the message, and they resented their colleague. They thought he was accusing them of having negative emotions and needing advice about how to handle them. Some of them were, in fact, angry. The teachers did not choose to regard their anger as a coming storm. They did not focus on their abdomens. They did not focus on the area just below their navels. Instead, they wrote back immediately, declaring that because they did not understand why he had sent it, his message had filled them with negative emotions. They told him that it would take a lot of practice for them to get over the negative emotions caused by his message. But, they went on, they did not intend to do this practice. Far from being troubled by their negative emotions, they said, they in fact liked having negative emotions, particularly about him and his message. The stories I'm going to read now are what I'm calling dream stories. There are quite a few of them in the book because I went through a period where I was very interested in not so much any dream that I had, but a dream that could be shaped, maybe usually shortened, condensed a little, made a little more succinct, so that it had a certain vividness rather than the usual narration of dreams, which as I'm sure you all know, is when it's not your own dream, is long and tedious and detailed and seems very irrelevant to anything. And I was also interested in sort of the opposite, which was a waking experience, which could be narrated as though it were a dream, a waking experience that had enough strangeness in it so that you could take out the parts that made it less strange and leave in the parts that were strange and tell it in the language of a dream. So I got very into doing this not only for my own things, but for friends' dreams and friends' experiences. The child. She is bending over her child. She can't leave her. The child is laid out in state on a table. She wants to take one more photograph of the child, probably the last. In life, the child would never sit still for a photograph. She says to herself, "I'm going to get the camera," as if saying to the child, "Don't move." In the train station. The train station is very crowded. People are walking in every direction at once, though some are standing still. A Tibetan Buddhist monk with shaved head and long wine-colored robe is in the crowd looking worried. I am standing still watching him. I have plenty of time before my train leaves because I have just missed a train. The monk sees me watching him. He comes up to me and tells me he is looking for track 3. I know where the tracks are. I show him the way. My friend's creation. We are in a clearing at night. Along one side, 4 Egyptian goddesses of immense size are positioned in profile and lit from behind. Black shapes of people come into the clearing and slip across the silhouettes. A moon is pasted against the dark sky. High up on a pole sits a cheerful, red-cheeked man who sings and plays a pipe. Now and then he climbs down from his pole. He is my friend's creation. And my friend asks me, what shall he be singing? The piano. We are about to buy a new piano. Our old upright has a crack all the way through the sounding board and other problems. We would like the piano shop to take it and resell it, but they tell us it is too badly damaged and cannot be resold to anyone else. They say it will have to be pushed over a cliff. This is how they will do it. 2 truck drivers take it to a remote spot. One driver walks away down the lane with his back turned, while the other shoves it over the cliff. The piano lesson. I am with my friend Christine. I have not seen her for a long time, perhaps 17 years. We talk about music and we agree that when we meet again, she will give me a piano lesson. In preparation for the lesson, she says, I must select and then study 1 Baroque piece, 1 classical, 1 romantic, and 1 modern. I am impressed by her seriousness and by the difficulty of the assignment. I am ready to do it. We will have the lesson in 1 year, she says. She will come to my house. But then later she tells me she's not sure she will be returning to this country. Maybe instead we will have the lesson in Italy. Or if not Italy, then of course Casablanca. The sentence and the young man. A sentence lies exposed to public view in an open trash can. It is the ungrammatical sentence, "Who sing?" We are watching it from where we stand concealed in a shadowed archway. We see a young man walk past the trash can several times, eyeing the sentence curiously. We will stay where we are, for fear that at any moment he will reach in quickly and fix it. Two characters in a paragraph. The story is only 2 paragraphs long. I'm working on the end of the second paragraph, which is the end of the story. I'm intent on this work and my back is turned. And while I'm working on the end, look what they're up to in the beginning. And they're not very far away. He seems to have drifted from where I put him and is hovering over her, only 1 paragraph away in the first paragraph. True, it is a dense paragraph, and they're in the very middle of it, and it's dark in there. I knew they were both in there, but when I left it and turned to the second paragraph, there wasn't anything going on between them. Now look. While I was working on the translation of Madame Bovary that I did a few years ago, I was reading Flaubert's correspondence in French, dating from the time he was working on the novel. I was hoping to get a few things out of doing that. One was to know what he was thinking and feeling about the writing, because he was very openly expressive about what was going on as he was writing and how he felt about it. So it was quite fascinating to look behind the scene at that. I also wanted to know what sort of style he had when he wasn't working so carefully over what would be a finished piece of fiction. And every now and then, I mean, some of the letters were frankly not very interesting to me because he was complaining about certain minor figures, literary figures that he was having trouble with on his visits up to Paris. I didn't know who these figures were. Wasn't particularly engrossed in that, but I felt obligated to read every single word in case there was a little reference that might be helpful. But every now and then, as a sort of treat, I began to see that he would tell a little story to his correspondent, who was usually Louise Collet, his mistress or his lover. And it would be almost a self-contained little story. And I began keeping track of where these were in the book and marking them. And then I more and more felt these were wasted, buried in the letters, because not all of his letters by any means are translated and available anyway. And here were these lovely little stories that were crying out to be taken and shaped and made into finished stories. So I began to do that, and I did 10 of them, and then another 3, and then one that I couldn't really call a story because it was really a harangue. It was a rant against industry, so people who make pins in Manchester. He's always very decided in his opinions. So I'm going to read a few of those. I did as little as I could, but I did work with the text a little bit for each of these. The cook's lesson. Today I have learned a great lesson. Our cook was my teacher. She is 25 years old and she's French. I discovered when I asked her that she did not know that Louis-Philippe is no longer King of France and we now have a republic. And yet it has been 5 years since he left the throne. She said the fact that he is no longer king simply does not interest her in the least. Those were her words. And I think of myself as an intelligent man, but compared to her, I'm an imbecile. After you left, You wanted me to tell you everything I did after we left each other. Well, I was very sad. It had been so lovely. When I saw your back disappear into the train compartment, I went up on the bridge to watch your train pass under me. That was all I saw. You were inside it. I looked after it as long as I could, and I listened to it. In the other direction, towards Rouen, the sky was red and striped with broad bands of purple. The sky would be long dark by the time I reached Rouen and you reached Paris. I lit another cigar. For a while, I paced back and forth. Then, because I felt so numb and tired, I went into a cafe across the street and drank a glass of kirsch. My train came into the station, heading in the opposite direction from yours. In the compartment, I met a man I knew from my school days. We talked for a long time, almost all the way back to Rouen. When I arrived, Louis was there to meet me, as we had planned, but my mother hadn't sent the carriage to take us home. We waited for a while, and then, by moonlight, we walked across the bridge and through the port. In that part of town, there are two places where we could hire a hackney cab. At the second place, the people live in an old church. It was dark. We knocked and woke the woman who came to the door in her nightcap. Imagine the scene in the middle of the night with the interior of that old church behind her, her jaws gaping in a yawn, a candle burning, the lace shawl she wore hanging down below her hips. The horse had to be harnessed, of course. The breeching band had broken, and we waited while they mended it with a piece of rope. On the way home, I told Louis about my old school friend, who is his old school friend, too. I told him how you and I had spent our time together. Out the window, the moon was shining on the river. I remembered another journey home late at night by moonlight. I described it to Louis. There was deep snow on the ground. I was in a sleigh wearing my red wool hat and wrapped in my fur cloak. I had lost my boots that day on my way to see an exhibition of savages from Africa. All the windows were open and I was smoking my pipe. The river was dark. The trees were dark. The moon shone on the fields of snow. They looked as smooth as satin. The snow-covered houses looked like little white bears curled up asleep. I imagined that I was in the Russian steppe. I thought I could hear reindeer snorting in the mist. I thought I could see a pack of wolves leaping up at the back of the sleigh. The eyes of the wolves were shining like coals on both sides of the road. When at last we reached home, it was 1 a.m. I wanted to organize my work table before I went to bed. Out my study window, the moon was still shining, on the water, on the towpath, and close to the house on the tulip tree by my window. When I was done, Louis went off to his room, and I went off to mine. The visit to the dentist. Last week I went to the dentist thinking he was going to pull my tooth. He said it would be better to wait and see if the pain subsided. Well, the pain did not subside. I was in agony and running a fever. So yesterday I went to have it pulled. On my way to see him, I had to cross the old marketplace where they used to execute people not so long ago. I remembered that when I was only 6 or 7 years old, returning home from school one day, I crossed the square after an execution had taken place. The guillotine was there. I saw fresh blood on the paving stones. They were carrying away the basket. Last night I thought about how I had entered the square on my way to the dentist, dreading what was about to happen to me, and how in the same way those people condemned to death also used to enter that square, dreading what was about to happen to them, though it was worse for them. When I fell asleep, I dreamed about the guillotine. The strange thing was that my little niece, who sleeps downstairs, also dreamed about a guillotine, though I hadn't said anything to her about it. I wonder if thoughts are fluid and flow downwards from one person to another within the same house. The execution. Here is another story about our compassion. In a village not far from here, a young man murdered a banker and his wife, then raped the servant girl and drank all the wine in the cellar. He was tried, found guilty, sentenced to death, and executed. Well, there was such interest in seeing this peculiar fellow die on the guillotine that people came from all over the countryside the night before, more than 10,000 of them. There were such crowds that the bakeries ran out of bread, and because the inns were full, people spent the night outside. To see this man die, they slept in the snow. And we shake our heads over the Roman gladiators. Oh, charlatans. The chairs. Louis has been in the church in Mantes looking at the chairs. He has been looking at them very closely. He wants to learn as much as he can about the people from looking at their chairs, he says. He started with the chair of a woman he calls Madame Fricotte. Maybe her name was written on the back of the chair. She must be very stout, he says. The seat of the chair has a deep hollow in it, and the prayer stool has been reinforced in a couple of places. Her husband may be a rich man because the prayer stool is upholstered in red velvet with brass tacks. Or he thinks the woman may be the widow of a rich man because there is no chair belonging to Monsieur Fricotte, unless he's an atheist. In fact, perhaps Madame Fricotte, if she is a widow, is looking for another husband, since the back of her chair is heavily stained with hair dye. And now I'll just read one story from the 5 stories in here that are letters of complaint. I discovered the delights of writing letters of complaint when I was objecting to the word cremains to a funeral parlor. I wrote to a funeral parlor complaining that the word might be something they were pleased with, having invented it and found useful, but we, the public, didn't really like having our loved ones called the cremains once they were in the form of ashes. And I did send that letter eventually, but heard nothing back. Then I found other things to complain about and wrote other letters of complaint. This one is called Letter to a Marketing Manager. Dear Harvard Bookstore Marketing Manager, I recently telephoned your bookstore to inquire about the matter described below and was told that you would be the person to contact. My question concerns an unfortunate biographical mistake printed in your January 2002 newsletter. I was startled to see on the back page of this issue that my recently published book was featured in the column titled Spotlight McLean Alumni. Now, I am aware that McLean's has a distinguished list of former patients and is among the most prestigious of institutions of this type in the country. But I've been inside its walls only once, and that was as a visitor. I stopped in to see a friend of mine from high school and spent no more than perhaps one awkward hour with him, since our conversation was at best difficult. Now, to be perfectly honest, in case this is the source of the misunderstanding, it is true that a member of my family was once incarcerated in McLean's. My great-grandfather of the same surname was for a time a patient of the institution, but this was in the early part of the last century, and he was not a seriously disturbed individual, as far as I can tell from what my father has said and from the letters and other documentary evidence I have in my possession. He was apparently no more than generally restless, apathetic at his place of employment, occasionally inspired with plans for irrational enterprises, dissatisfied with domestic life, and visibly oppressed by his wife's emphatically demanding and restrictive nature. Although he did indeed escape the institution once and was then forcibly returned to it, he was several months later judged to be rehabilitated and was released. He thereafter led a tranquil, if rather solitary, life apart from his family with a single manservant on a farm in Harwich, Massachusetts. I offer this information in case it may be useful, though I can think of no reason why you would confuse me with him. However, no other explanation occurs to me for your mistaken identification, unless your buyers assumed on the basis of the contents of my book, its title, or my admittedly somewhat wild-eyed photograph, that at some time in the past I was an inmate of McLean's. It is always nice to have some attention paid to one's book, but embarrassing to be misidentified in this way. Could you please throw some light on the matter? Yours sincerely. And I'm going to end with some very short stories. It's hard to call them stories, but I'm calling them stories anyway, which I started writing when I was translating Proust, because I was reacting, I think, to his very long sentences and his very long pages and his very long book. So I wanted to see how short I could make a piece that didn't just vanish off the page. This one is called Bloomington. Now that I've been here for a little while, I can say with confidence that I have never been here before. Contingency versus necessity. He could be our dog, but he is not our dog, so he barks at us. Contingency versus necessity 2, on vacation. He could be my husband, but he is not my husband. He is her husband. And so he takes her picture, not mine, as she stands in her flowered beach outfit in front of the old fortress. The Bad Novel. This dull, difficult novel I have brought with me on my trip, I keep trying to read it. I have gone back to it so many times, each time dreading it and each time finding it no better than the last time, that by now it has become something of an old friend. My old friend, the bad novel. Can't and won't. I was recently denied a writing prize because they said I was lazy. What they meant by lazy was that I used too many contractions. For instance, I would not write out in full the words cannot and will not, but instead contracted them to can't and won't. Her geography, Alabama. She thinks for a moment that Alabama is a city in Georgia. It is called Alabama, Georgia. The language of the telephone company. The trouble you reported recently is now working properly. her birthday. 105 years old. She wouldn't be alive today, even if she hadn't died. And the last one, PhD. All these years, I thought I had a PhD, but I do not have a PhD. Thank you.
I will read the English first. There will be 2 excerpts read. This first one has in it a character named Charles XVI. He is a leading citizen of the town. He is the manager of a shoe factory. He's also an amateur photographer, which helps his friends pull some strings when the war begins and get him a spot outside the infantry. And everyone believes that this war will be over in 6 weeks. This mosquito at 1 o'clock appears in air of a normal end of summer blue over the département of the Marne in northeastern France. Let's propel ourselves up toward this insect. As we draw closer, it gradually grows into a small plane, a Farman F-37, a 2-seater biplane carrying 2 men, a pilot and an observer sitting one behind the other in crude seats barely protected by 2 rudimentary windshields. Buffeted by the wind, without the shelter of the closed cockpits that will eventually appear, the pair seem installed upon a narrow panoramic porch from which one can admire the landscape of nascent conflict. Columns of trucks and soldiers on the move, cantonments, and their parade grounds. On the ground itself, where all that is crawling and groaning, and the earthbound troops are sweating, it is extremely hot. One of the last heat waves of this mid-August before the swing into autumn takes hold. But high in the sky, it can be cooler, and the men have bundled up. Underneath their helmets and big protective goggles, dressed alike in leather jackets and trousers, overalls of black rubberized cloth, lined with rabbit fur and reinforced with goatskin, plus fur-lined boots and gloves, the 2 men look all the more identical because their bodies are invisible, aside from their cheeks, jaws, and mouths, as they try to talk to each other but prove unable to exchange more than poorly articulated exclamations they can hardly hear, deafened as they are by the 80-horsepower engine, while the brisk air sweeps away their words. The 2 men seem cast in the same mold, figurines with faintly visible soldered joints, identical lead soldiers except for a brown scarf around the neck of the observer named Charles XVI, the pilot being Alfred Noblesse. They are not armed, which is to say, not yet carrying the 130-odd pounds of bombs this biplane can handle. The small machine gun on board is not operational. Although fixed to the fuselage, its design has still not produced satisfactory results, given that it's difficult to aim and reload while piloting, especially since the synchronization gear for firing through the spinning propeller is not yet just right. What's more, they are not afraid, despite the novelty of this assignment, for which they've received barely any training, having been sent on only this one reconnaissance mission. Noblesse is at the controls, glancing briefly at the altimeter, compass, speedometer, and inclinometer. Charles XVI holds an ordnance survey map open on his lap. His brown scarf is entangled with the straps of his binoculars, and the aerial photography camera hanging heavily around his neck. As they fly, they study the landscape, their only orders being to observe. Later will come the dogfights and bombing, the no-fly zones over the enemy's territory, the attacks from dirigibles and barrage balloons when things will, and very soon, become immeasurably worse. For the moment, reconnaissance is all, taking photographs, reporting troop movements, calculating future adjustments of fire, noting the positions of lines, the capabilities and layouts of airfields and Zeppelin hangars, along with their outbuildings, depots, garages, command posts, dormitories, canteens. So they're aloft, keeping their eyes open, when another mosquito shows up way behind the farman on the left, a new and almost imperceptible insect that neither says nor Noblesse notices at first, and which, as they have done, will grow bigger and clearer. Wooden framework covered with canvas and adorned with a Maltese cross on the wings, rudder, and the wheels of the landing gear. A fuselage of duralumin. It's an aviatic biplane, making a beeline towards the farman that leaves little doubt as to its intentions, particularly since, as it draws nearer, Charles says spots an infantry rifle protruding from its cockpit and aimed unmistakably his way, upon which he immediately warns Noblesse. We are in the first weeks of the war, and the warplane is a new mode of transportation never before used in a military context. A Hotchkiss machine gun has been mounted on the farman, true, but as an experiment and without ammunition, so it isn't operational. The use of repeating weapons aboard planes has not yet been authorized by the powers that be, less because of their weight and imperfect performance than for fear that the enemy will take note and arm their planes in turn. Until things change, and as a precaution, without paying too much attention to their higher-ups, flight crews do carry along rifles or handguns. Spurred by the sight of that infantry rifle, while Noblesse begins evasive maneuvers with the farman, zigzagging to keep out of the enemy's line of fire, Charles rummages through a pocket of his overalls to pull out a Savage pistol especially adapted for aviation, fitted with a screen to catch spent casings so they won't stray into the propeller. In the minutes that follow, without losing sight of each other, the aviatique and the farman will fly over, pass, avoid, and close in on each other almost to the point of touching, a dry run of what will become the main maneuvers of aerobatics: loop, roll, spin, Humpty Bump, Immelmann, with each plane looking to feint while at the same time seeking the best angle of attack to achieve a ballistic advantage. Charles is crouched in his seat, both hands on the pistol grip to steady his gun, unlike the enemy observer, who constantly reorients the barrel of his rifle. When Noblesse suddenly sends his plane climbing into the sky, the aviatique keeps close on his tail, slipping suddenly under him to climb again abruptly while turning, thus targeting the farman while hiding the aviatique from Charles behind his own pilot, leaving him helpless. A single shot then sounds from the artillery rifle. A bullet travels 40 feet through the air at 3,280 feet per second at an altitude of 2,300 feet to enter the left eye of Noblesse and exit above his nape, behind his right ear. And then the farman, now beyond his control, remains for a moment on its flight path before heading down at an increasingly steep angle as Charles, gaping over Alfred's slumped shoulder, sees the ground on which he will crash, approaching at tip-top speed, offering not a hint of hope for any alternative save his imminent and permanent death. Ground currently occupied by Jean-Echenoz, a pretty village in the Champagne-Ardenne region, and whose inhabitants are called Joncaviduliens.
Ce moustique, à 13 heures, apparaît dans l'air normalement bleu d'une fin d'été sur le département de la Marne. Propulsons-nous vers cet insecte. À mesure qu'on l'approche, il grossit peu à peu jusqu'à se transformer en petit avion, biplan, biplace, de modèle Farman F-37, mené par 2 hommes, un pilote et un observateur assis l'un derrière l'autre dans des fauteuils bruts, à peine protégés par 2 pare-brises rudimentaires. Giflé par le vent du vol, sans être abrité par un cockpit clos, comme il en viendra plus tard, il semble installé sur une étroite terrasse panoramique d'où l'on peut admirer le paysage de conflits débutants. Colonnes de camions et de soldats en marche, terrain de manœuvre et cantonnement. À la surface du sol où tout cela rampe et grogne, où transpirent les troupes survolées, on a extrêmement chaud. Une des dernières canicules de ce milieu d'août avant que s'amorce le virage de l'automne. Mais haut dans le ciel, comme il peut faire plus frais, on s'est couvert en conséquence. Sous leurs casques et leurs grosses lunettes de protection, mêmement vêtus de combinaisons de toile noire caoutchoutée, doublées de lapin et renforcées de chèvre, vestes et pantalons en cuir, gants et chaussons fourrés, les 2 hommes se ressemblent d'autant plus que rien n'est visible de leur corps sauf leurs joues, leurs mâchoires et leur bouche par laquelle ils essaient de se parler, mais sans pouvoir guère échanger mieux que des exclamations qu'ils articulent mal et n'entendent qu'à peine, assourdis par les 80 chevaux du moteur, leurs paroles coupées par l'air vif. Ils ont l'air coulés dans le même moule, figurines aux joints de soudure à peine visibles, soldats de plomb identiques, excepté une écharpe marron autour du cou de l'observateur nommé Charles XVI, le pilote s'appelant Alfred Noblesse. Ils ne sont pas armés, du moins pas encore chargés des 60 kilos de bombes que ce biplan peut embarquer. La petite mitrailleuse de bord n'est pas opérationnelle. Quoique fixée sur le fuselage, sa configuration n'a toujours pas donné de résultat satisfaisant, pour autant qu'il est difficile de viser et recharger tout en pilotant, et d'autant plus que le système de synchronisation du tir à travers l'hélice n'est pas tout à fait au point. D'ailleurs, ils n'ont pas peur, étant seulement investis d'une seule mission de reconnaissance, et malgré la nouveauté de cette tâche pour laquelle ils sont à peine formés. Noblesse pilote la machine, jetant des regards brefs sur l'altimètre, la boussole, les indicateurs de vitesse et de pente. Charles XVI maintient sur ses genoux une carte d'état-major, son écharpe brune emmêlée aux courroies des jumelles et de l'appareil aérophotographique qui pendent lourdement à son cou. On vole en regardant le paysage, sans autre consigne qu'observer. Plus tard viendront la chasse et les bombardements, l'interdiction de survol de certaines zones à l'adversaire, l'attaque des ballons dirigeables et captifs lorsque les choses en arriveront, très bientôt, à s'aggraver sans mesure. L'heure n'est dans l'immédiat qu'à l'examen, prise de photos, signalement des mouvements de troupes, réglage des tirs à venir, repérage des lignes, des aménagements d'aérodromes et de hangars à zeppelin, ainsi que leurs annexes, dépôts, garages, cabanes de commandement, dortoirs, cantines. On vole donc, ouvrant l'œil, lorsqu'un autre moustique apparaît loin derrière le Farman sur la gauche, nouvel insecte à peine perceptible que n'aperçoivent d'abord ni XVI ni Noblesse et qui, grossissant à son tour, va se préciser. Structure en bois, revêtue de toile et ornée de la croix de Malte sur les ailes, la queue et les jantes du chariot d'atterrissage, fuselage en duralumin, c'est un biplace aviatique dont la trajectoire vers le Farman laisse peu de doute quant à ses intentions, d'autant moins qu'approchant encore, comme Charles XVI distingue un fusil d'infanterie saillant de son poste de pilotage et pointé sans équivoque vers eux, il alerte aussitôt Noblesse. Nous sommes dans les premières semaines de guerre et l'avion est un mode de transport neuf, jamais utilisé dans un but militaire. La mitrailleuse Hotchkiss a certes été montée sur le Farman, mais à titre expérimental et sans munitions, donc désactivée. L'usage des armes à répétition n'est pas encore autorisé sur les avions par les autorités, moins à cause de leur poids et de leur fonctionnement précaire que par crainte que l'ennemi s'en inspire et s'outille à son tour. En attendant que ça change, et par précaution, sans trop en faire état à leur hiérarchie, les équipages emportent quand même des fusils ou des armes de poing. À la vue de ce fusil d'infanterie, pendant que Noblesse commence de manœuvrer le Farman en zigzag pour se tenir hors de la ligne de tir adverse, Charles fouille une poche de sa combinaison pour en extraire un pistolet Savage, spécialement bricolé pour l'aviation, ceint d'un grillage récupérateur pour éviter que les étuis vides aillent s'égarer dans l'hélice. Au cours des minutes qui suivent, l'Aviatique et le Farman se survolent, se croisent, s'évitent, se rejoignent jusqu'à se toucher presque sans se quitter de l'œil, ébauchant ce que deviendront les figures principales de voltige aérienne, boucle, tonneau, vrille, un petit bump Immelmann, chacun cherchant la feinte en même temps que le meilleur angle d'attaque pour s'assurer un avantage balistique. Charles est blotti sur son siège, assurant à deux mains la tenue fixe du pistolet, cependant que l'observateur ennemi oriente au contraire sans cesse le canon de son fusil. Comme Noblesse fait soudain grimper son avion dans le ciel, l'Aviatique le talonne, se glisse sous lui pour remonter brusquement en virant, assurant du même pas l'exposition du Farman dans lequel Charles se retrouve masqué par son pilote, donc dans l'impossibilité d'agir. Un seul coup part alors du fusil d'artillerie. Une balle traverse 12 mètres d'air à 700 d'altitude et 1000 par seconde pour venir s'introduire dans l'œil gauche de Noblesse et ressortir au-dessus de sa nuque, derrière son oreiller droite, et dès lors, le Farman, privé de contrôle, reste un moment sur son air avant de décliner en pente de plus en plus verticale, et Charles, béant par-dessus l'épaule affaissée d'Alfred, voit s'approcher le sol sur lequel il va s'écraser, à toute allure et sans alternative que sa mort immédiate, irréversible, sans l'ombre d'un espoir, sol présentement occupé par l'agglomération de Jonchery-sur-Vesle, joli village de la région de Champagne-Ardenne et dont les habitants s'appellent les Joncaviduliens.
In this last excerpt, we meet Antime, who would be the hero of this book if the book had a hero, but it does not. Antime is an educated man. He's the chief accountant at that shoe factory, and he has some fishing and cafe buddies. Padiolo is a butcher's boy, Bossis is a knacker, and Arsenal is a saddler, and they are doing their best to stay together in the trenches. One following morning, much like the others, snow decided to fall along with the shells, at a different rhythm, naturally, for the shells had been less plentiful than usual, only 3 so far that day, whereas Padiolo decided to complain. I'm hungry, Padiolo was moaning. I'm cold, I'm thirsty, and also I'm tired. Well, sure, said Arsenal, just like the rest of us. But I feel very low, too, continued Padiolo. Plus, I've got a stomach ache. It'll pass, your stomach ache, predicted Antime. We've all got one, more or less. Yes, but the worst part, insisted Padiolo, it's that I can't figure out if I feel low because of the stomach ache. You're beginning to piss us off, observed Bossis. Or if I have a stomach ache because I feel low, if you see what I mean. Fuck off, announced Arsenal. That's when the first 3 shots that had flown too far, exploding uselessly behind the lines, were followed by a 4th and more carefully aimed 105 millimeter percussion fuse shell that produced better results in the trench. After blowing the captain's orderly into 6 pieces, it spun off a mess of shrapnel that decapitated a liaison officer, pinned Bossis through his solar plexus to a tunnel prop, hacked up various soldiers from various angles, and bisected the body of an infantry scout lengthwise. Stationed not far from the man, Antime was for an instant able to see all the scout's organs, sliced in two from his brain to his pelvis, as in an anatomical drawing, before hunkering down automatically and half off balance to protect himself, deafened by the god-awful din, blinded by the torrent of rocks and dirt, the clouds of ash and fine debris, vomiting meanwhile from fear and revulsion all over his lower legs and onto his feet, sunk up to the ankles in mud. After that, everything seemed just about over. As the smoke and dust gradually cleared from the trench, a kind of quiet returned, even though other massive detonations still sounded solemnly all around, but at a distance, as if in an echo. Those who'd been spared stood up fairly spattered with bits of military flesh, dirt-crusted scraps rats were already snatching off them and fighting over among the bodily remains here and there. A head without its lower jaw, a hand wearing its wedding ring, a single foot in its boot, an eye. So silence seemed intent on returning when a tardy piece of shrapnel showed up from who knows where, and one wonders how, as clipped as a postscript, an iron fragment shaped like a polished Neolithic axe, smoking hot, the size of a man's hand, fully as sharp as a large shard of glass. Without even a glance at the others, as if it were settling a personal score, it sped directly toward Antime as he was getting to his feet and, willy-nilly, lopped off his right arm clean as a whistle, just below the shoulder. 5 hours later, everybody at the field hospital congratulated Antime, showing him how they envied him this good wound, one of the best there was. Serious, of course, crippling, but not more than many others, really, and coveted by all as one of those that ship you away forever from the front. Such was the enthusiasm of his comrades, propped up on their elbows at the edge of their cots, waving their képis, at least those who weren't too damaged to wave, that Antime almost didn't dare complain, or weep from pain, or lament the loss of his arm, the disappearance of which he was not actually fully aware. Not fully aware either, in truth, of the pain or the state of the world in general, no more than he could envisage, looking at the others without seeing them, never being himself able ever again to lean on his elbows except on one side. Out of his coma, and then out of what served as a surgical unit, his eyes open but focused on nothing, it simply seemed to him, although he didn't really know why, that given the laughter, there must be some reason to be happy. Reason enough for him to feel almost ashamed of his condition, again without fully understanding why. So as if he were reacting automatically to the other patient's applause, to join in the merriment, he gave a laugh that came out like a long spasm and sounded like braying, which shut everyone up instanter. A serious shot of morphine then returned him to the absence of all things.
L'un des matins suivants, assez semblable aux autres, la neige a pris le parti de tomber en même temps que les obus. Certes, pas au même rythme. Ils étaient un peu moins nombreux ce matin-là, seulement 3 jusqu'ici, cependant que Padiolo prenait celui de se plaindre. J'ai faim, géniait donc Padiolo, j'ai froid, j'ai soif et puis je suis fatigué. Eh oui, a dit Arsenal, comme nous tous. Et puis je me sens aussi très oppressé, a poursuivi Padiolo, sans compter que j'ai mal au ventre. Ça va passer, ton mal au ventre, a pronostiqué Antime. On l'a tous plus ou moins. Oui, mais le pire, a insisté Padiolo, c'est que je ne sais pas trop si je me sens oppressé parce que j'ai mal au ventre, tu commences à nous emmerder, a fait observer Bossis, ou si j'ai mal au ventre parce que je me sens oppressé. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Fous-nous la paix, a conclu Arsenal. C'est alors qu'après les 3 premiers obus tombés trop loin, puis vainement explosés au-delà des lignes, un 4e percutant de 105 mieux ajusté a produit de meilleurs résultats dans la tranchée. Après qu'il a disloqué l'ordonnance du capitaine en 6 morceaux, quelques-uns de ces éclats ont décapité un agent de liaison, cloué Bossis par le plexus à un étai de sape, haché divers soldats sous divers angles et sectionné longitudinalement le corps d'un chasseur éclaireur. Posté non loin de celui-ci, Antime a pu distinguer un instant de la cervelle au bassin tous les organes du chasseur éclaireur coupés en 2 comme sur une planche anatomique, avant de s'accroupir spontanément en perte d'équilibre pour essayer de se protéger, assourdi par l'énorme fracas, aveuglé par les torrents de pierres, de terre, les nuées de poussière et de fumée, tout en vomissant de peur et de répulsion sur ses mollets et autour d'eux ses chaussures, enfoncées jusqu'aux chevilles dans la boue. Tout a ensuite paru sur le point de s'achever. L'opacité se défaisant peu à peu dans la tranchée, une sorte de calme y revenait, même si d'autres détonations énormes, solennelles, sonnaient encore tout autour d'elle, mais à distance, comme en écho. Les épargnés se sont relevés plus ou moins constellés de fragments de chair militaire, lambeaux terreux que déjà leur arrachaient et se disputaient les rats, parmi les débris de corps çà et là, une tête sans mâchoire inférieure, une main revêtue de son alliance, un pied seul dans sa botte, un œil. Le silence semblait donc vouloir se rétablir quand un éclat d'obus retardataire a surgi, venu d'on ne sait où et on se demande comment, bref, comme un post-scriptum. C'était un éclat de fonte en forme de hache polie néolithique, brûlant, fumant, de la taille d'une main, non moins affûté qu'un gros éclat de verre. Comme s'il s'agissait de régler une affaire personnelle, sans un regard pour les autres, il a directement fendu l'air vers Antime, en train de se redresser, et, sans discuter, lui a sectionné le bras droit tout net, juste au-dessous de l'épaule. Cinq heures après, à l'infirmerie de campagne, tout le monde a félicité Antime. Tous ont montré, comme on lui enviait cette bonne blessure, l'une des meilleures qu'on puisse imaginer, grave, certes, invalidante, mais au fond pas plus que tant d'autres, désirée par chacun, car étant de celles qui vous assurent d'être à jamais éloignées du front. L'enthousiasme était tel chez les copains accoudés sur leurs brancards, agitant leurs képis, du moins ceux qui, pas trop amochés, en étaient capables, qu'Antime n'a presque pas osé se plaindre, ni crier de douleur, ni regretter son bras, dont il n'avait d'ailleurs pas bien conscience de la disparition. Pas bien conscience en vérité non plus de cette douleur, ni de l'état du monde en général, pas plus qu'il n'a envisagé, voyant les autres sans les voir, de ne jamais pouvoir s'accouder lui-même que d'un côté, dorénavant. Une fois sorti de son coma, puis de ce qui tenait lieu de bloc opératoire, les yeux ouverts mais fixés sur nulle part, il lui a juste semblé, sans trop savoir pourquoi, vu ses rires, qu'il devait y avoir lieu de se réjouir. Lieu au point d'avoir presque honte de son état, sans bien savoir pourquoi non plus. Comme s'il réagissait mécaniquement aux ovations de l'infirmerie, pour s'y accorder, il a produit un rire en forme de long spasme qui a sonné comme un hennissement, faisant taire aussitôt tout le monde, avant qu'une solide injection de morphine le ramenât à l'absence des choses. Merci.
Merci.